What happens when a mysterious millionaire whispers to an innocent young woman, "Are you ready?" In that decisive moment, two lonely souls were about to discover that true love can be born when we least expect it. Tell me, where are you watching us from? If you want to know what happened after that question that changed everything, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This story will touch your soul. The scent of magnolia blossoms filled the air when Eleanor stepped into New Orleans' most exclusive dance hall for the first time, her hands trembling as she held the golden invitation she had found on her desk at the Tulane University Library. The light from the crystal chandeliers spilled over the polished marble, creating a tapestry of sparkles that seemed to welcome only her, an intruder in a world she never believed would belong to her. Coincidences are merely destiny whispering to the distracted, she thought, as her eyes swept across the magnificence of the place, remembering the phrase from the philosophy book she had been organizing just before finding that mysterious invitation. At 22, Eleanor Blackwood had grown accustomed to living in the shadows of existence. Her fingers, delicate yet strong, caressed the spines of ancient books with more tenderness than she had ever experienced on her own skin. The library was her sanctuary, a haven where silence didn't hurt and where every open page was a promise of escape. She paused at the threshold of the hall, her midnight blue dress, the only one she owned for special occasions, contrasting with the elaborate attire of the other guests. A sensation of vertigo overwhelmed her, making her consider retreat when she felt a presence behind her. "Nervousness is merely the antechamber to courage, Miss Blackwood," said a deep, warm voice. Eleanor turned and found herself face to face with Griffin Montgomery, the mysterious real estate developer, who frequented the library every afternoon, always reading the same classical philosophy books that she organized with such care. Under the amber light of the hall, his 41 years suited him with an elegance she had never noticed under the austere lighting of the library. "Mr. Montgomery, I didn't expect," she stammered, suddenly aware of the social abyss that separated them. Griffin smiled, and for an instant, Eleanor glimpsed something more than courtesy in those amber eyes. "Please call me Griffin. And yes, I was expecting you to come. In fact, I confess I've been watching the door for an hour." A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. It wasn't just the confession that surprised her, but the vulnerability with which it had been pronounced. The relentless real estate developer, whose name appeared frequently in local newspapers, now seemed so human, so attainable. In the center of the hall, a couple of dancers began the first measures of a smooth jazz number, as if it were the prelude to something more intense to come. "Are you ready for your first jazz lesson?" he asked, extending a gloved hand to her. In that exact moment, as the magnolia scent intensified with the night breeze entering through the open balcony doors, Eleanor was certain that her life was about to change forever. What she couldn't imagine was that this golden hall, with its historic tiles reflecting soft lights and the sound of a saxophone resonating off marble walls, would become the setting for the most extraordinary transformation of her soul. Eleanor contemplated Griffin's outstretched hand like someone observing an abyss before leaping. Her heart beat so forcefully that she feared he might hear it above the music. "I don't know how to dance jazz," she confessed, with a mixture of embarrassment and honesty that disarmed Griffin. He smiled, and his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that gave him an unexpected warmth. "Nobody is born knowing, Eleanor. Jazz isn't learned, it's felt here," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "It's like true love. When it arrives, you simply know it's been waiting for you all your life." His words hung suspended between them, laden with a meaning that went beyond dance. Eleanor finally took his hand and allowed herself to be guided to the center of the hall, where the polished wood reflected the movement of the dancers like a liquid mirror. The best jazz musicians from the French Quarter, contracted specifically for this night, began to mark the beat. Eleanor didn't know that Griffin had organized all this after hearing her casually mention in the library that her Louisiana grandmother had been a jazz singer, a dream she had never been able to pursue due to her premature entry into the Charleston orphanage. "Feel the floor beneath your feet," Griffin whispered in her ear as he guided her through the first steps. "Jazz is the most honest conversation you'll ever have with the earth." The tension in Eleanor's body began to dissolve with each footfall, with each gentle turn. Her movements, initially awkward, started finding their own rhythm, as if some ancestral memory were awakening within her. "You have natural talent," he commented, surprised by how quickly she grasped the essence of the dance. "I have a good guide," Eleanor responded, and for the first time all evening she allowed herself to smile without reservation. The music reached a crescendo, and Griffin spun her with such precision that Eleanor felt she was flying. When he drew her back to him, their faces came dangerously close. "Why me?" she suddenly asked, unable to contain the question that had been tormenting her since she found the invitation. "Among all the people you could have invited," Griffin looked at her with an intensity that froze time around them. "Because in a world of people who only see the value of books by their market price, you see stories, lives, souls. I've watched you for months in the library, Eleanor. The delicacy with which you handle each volume as if they were treasures, that's how hearts should be treated." Eleanor was left speechless, moved by the depth of that observation. Nobody had really seen her not like that. The music changed, becoming more intimate, and the professional dancers discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone in the center of the hall. Now it was just the two of them, moving to the rhythm of something that transcended the notes of the saxophone. "Do you know what intrigues me most about you?" Griffin continued, guiding her in a slow turn. "That you seem to have no idea how extraordinary you are." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. Kind words had always been scarce in her life, and now this man was offering them with a generosity that overwhelmed her. "I'm not extraordinary. I'm a survivor," she responded, revealing for the first time the scars of her past. "Survival is the first act of rebellion against an adverse fate," he said. "And believe me, I recognize survivors. It takes one to identify another." The music stopped, but they continued moving for a few seconds more, caught in a bubble where time functioned according to its own rules. When they finally stopped, Eleanor knew she had crossed an invisible threshold, and the path back to her old life was vanishing with each heartbeat. The Tulane University Library took on a new dimension for Eleanor after that night at the dance hall. What had once been a refuge had now become a stage of anticipation. Every afternoon at 5 o'clock sharp, Griffin would walk through the ancient wooden doors with a book under his arm, always with the same determined look that seemed to search for her among the shelves. For 3 weeks his ritual remained unchanged. He would select a volume of classical philosophy, sit at the table closest to Eleanor's desk, and read in silence for exactly 2 hours. Sometimes their gazes would meet over the pages, and an entire universe of unspoken words would travel between them. That Tuesday afternoon, however, something changed. Eleanor found a folded note inside the copy of Nicomachean Ethics that Griffin had returned. "Knowledge takes us to extraordinary places, but sometimes we need music to truly understand them. Stay after closing. G." Her heart leaped. With trembling fingers, she tucked the note into her skirt pocket and continued cataloguing books, aware that the hours until closing would drag with exasperating slowness. When the last student left the library and the clock struck 9 in the evening, Eleanor locked the main door. The usual silence of the place now seemed charged with expectation. "Griffin?" she called softly, her voice barely a whisper among the century-old shelves. A guitar melody began to sound from the medieval literature section, so soft at first that Eleanor thought it might be a product of her imagination. She followed the sound, and as she turned the corner of a bookshelf, she stopped short. Griffin had transformed the space between 2 bookshelves into a small dance studio. An antique lamp projected a warm light onto the floor where he had laid a red carpet. A discreet speaker played the chords of a slow blues number, and beside it, Griffin waited for her with 2 glasses of red wine. "The library after hours. My favorite place in all of New Orleans," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "The only time when books can whisper their secrets without being interrupted." Eleanor took the glass, intentionally brushing her fingers against his. "This is irregular. I could lose my job," she said, though the smile forming on her lips belied her concern. "We're just appreciating literature in a more sensorial way," he responded, his eyes gleaming with complicity. "Besides, I promised to teach you to dance jazz, remember? There's no better setting than this, surrounded by stories that have survived centuries." For the next 2 hours, the library became their private sanctuary. The aroma of ancient books mingled with Eleanor's subtle perfume, creating an atmosphere that Griffin knew he would never forget. Between dance steps and sips of wine, the barriers began to fall. "Why do you always read the same books?" she asked as they practiced a particularly complex turn. There are thousands of volumes here, but you always return to the same 5 or 6 titles. Griffin spun her before responding, as if he needed that moment to decide how much to reveal. Because they're the ones you reorganize every morning, he finally confessed. I discovered I could learn something about you through the books you treated with special care, so I read them all, one by one, seeking to understand what you saw in them. The revelation made Eleanor lose her rhythm for an instant, stumbling slightly. That's, she began, not knowing whether to feel flattered or intimidated. Excessive? Obsessive? He completed with a self-critical smile. Probably. But when you've lived long enough, you learn that people rarely say what truly matters. Their actions, however, never lie. The music changed to a slower blues, and their movements naturally adapted to the new rhythm. The flowers, Eleanor said suddenly, connecting pieces of an invisible puzzle. The fresh flowers that appear on my desk every morning. That's you. Griffin nodded, and for the first time since she'd known him, Eleanor detected a glimpse of vulnerability in his gaze. Magnolias on Mondays because your look seems more melancholic that day. Orchids on Wednesdays because I've seen you smile more when arranging them. And jasmines on Fridays because it's the scent of my childhood, she completed, surprised that he had captured this detail she had never shared with anyone. A silence laden with meaning settled between them, broken only by the final chords of the guitar. In the dimness of the library, with centuries of dust floating in rays of light filtering through high windows, Eleanor felt that something fundamental was changing within her. It was as if each book around them was witnessing a new chapter beginning to be written in her own story. The sweet, spiced aroma flooded the kitchen of Eleanor's small apartment in the Garden District. Griffin, with the sleeves of his impeccable shirt rolled up to his elbows and an apron that seemed ridiculously domestic over his usual elegance, stirred a mixture in the pan with almost scientific precision. The secret is in the cinnamon, he explained, as he poured a bit more honey over the slices of bread soaked in milk. My grandmother used to say cinnamon is the bridge between the earthly and the divine. Eleanor observed him from the kitchen doorway, fascinated by this new facet of the powerful businessman. It was their 4th meeting outside the library, but the first in her home, a space she had until now maintained as her last bastion of privacy. I never imagined you knew how to cook, she commented, moving closer to better observe the process. Especially bread pudding. Griffin smiled without taking his eyes off the pan, where the slices were beginning to brown. There are many things you still don't know about me, Eleanor. And when you mentioned that bread pudding was your favorite dessert from childhood at the orphanage, he paused, carefully flipping one of the slices. I decided to learn how to make it. The revelation hit Eleanor with the force of an unexpected wave. She had mentioned bread pudding only in passing, in a casual conversation about childhood memories while reorganizing the culinary section in the library. You learned to make bread pudding? For me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Griffin finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor's heart race. I took lessons with Mrs. Dupree, the best pastry chef in the quarter. 3 weeks, 4 hours each Sunday, he confessed with a shy smile that contrasted with his usual confidence. I wanted you to taste a bread pudding that lived up to your memory. Something broke inside Eleanor at that moment. It wasn't just the gesture. It was what it represented. Someone had really listened, paid attention to the small details that made up her being. Griffin turned off the heat and transferred the bread pudding to a plate, sprinkling it with cinnamon and sugar. The aroma instantly evoked in Eleanor the image of Sister Margaret, the nun who once a year during Easter prepared bread pudding for all the children at the Charleston orphanage. Try it, Griffin invited, offering her a still warm piece. Eleanor closed her eyes as she took the first bite. The explosion of flavors, the honey, the cinnamon, the slight touch of vanilla that was barely perceptible, instantly transported her back to her childhood. For a moment, she was again that 5-year-old girl, savoring the only sweet of the year that made her forget, if only for a few minutes, that she had been abandoned. When she opened her eyes, they were moist. It's exactly how I remember it, she said, her voice breaking. Griffin set the plate on the counter and for the first time since they'd met, touched her without the pretext of dancing. His fingers gently traced Eleanor's cheek, wiping away a solitary tear. There are flavors that define us, Eleanor. that anchor us to who we truly are beyond what life has done to us. It was then that she noticed the small burns on his fingers, recent marks that spoke of previous attempts, of practice, of persistence. "Your hands," she murmured, taking them in hers to examine them. "A small price," he responded with simplicity. The books weren't the only things that burned me during my learning. The intimacy of the moment, the shared vulnerability, created an invisible bridge between two souls that had spent too much time isolated. Without thinking, Eleanor rose to her tiptoes and softly kissed one of the small burns on Griffin's hand. It was an instinctive gesture, almost childlike in its innocence, but laden with a meaning that transcended the physical. Griffin caught his breath, surprised by the unexpected tenderness of the gesture. "No one has ever," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary. In the small apartment, with the aroma of bread pudding permeating every corner and the light of the New Orleans sunset filtering through the windows, both understood they were entering a territory for which there were no maps. And for the first time in a long while, neither of them was afraid. The invitation arrived in a parchment envelope sealed with crimson wax. Inside, a single line written in elegant calligraphy: "The Montgomery family requests the honor of your presence this Sunday at Oakidge." Eleanor held the invitation between her trembling fingers as she sat on one of the benches in Audubon Park, where Griffin had asked her to meet him. Around her, the gardens exhaled the intoxicating perfume of the southern spring, but not even the beauty of the surroundings could calm her anxiety. Meeting Griffin's family meant crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. During the past 3 months, they had built their relationship on the margins of their public lives: secret meetings in the library after hours, dawn walks along the Mississippi when the streets were still asleep, dinners in small restaurants in distant neighborhoods where no one would recognize the prominent businessman. Griffin arrived punctually, as always. He was dressed more casually than usual: light linen pants and a blue shirt with rolled sleeves, an outfit that made him seem younger and less intimidating than his usual tailored suits. "I see you received my message," he said, sitting beside her and noticing the invitation in her hands. "Griffin, I don't belong in that world," Eleanor responded directly, without taking her eyes off the paper. "A lunch with your family at Oakidge. That estate appears in architecture magazines. Your sister Priscilla is practically a celebrity in New Orleans. What am I going to do there?" He took her hands in his, a gesture that had become habitual between them. "Be exactly who you are, the woman who has brought color back to my world," he responded, with a simplicity that disarmed Eleanor's defenses. "I'm not asking you to play a role. I'm asking you to allow me to show you a part of my life that also defines me." Eleanor sighed deeply. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "These months have been perfect, like living inside a bubble. But this," she lightly shook the invitation, "this makes everything real." Griffin remained silent for a moment, as if carefully considering his words. "When I was 23, I lost everything I had in a bad investment," he began with a measured voice. "My father had just died. I wanted to prove to the world that I could be as brilliant as he was, and I bet every cent of my inheritance on a real estate project in Key West." Eleanor listened attentively, aware that this was the first time Griffin had spoken about his past with such frankness. "The project failed. I was left with nothing. For 2 years I lived in a tiny apartment in the Marigny, working as a waiter to survive," he continued, his gaze lost in memories. "My family turned their backs on me, except for my sister Priscilla. She was the only one who believed in me when I decided to try again." "I didn't know any of this," Eleanor murmured, surprised. "Few people do. I've carefully constructed an image of uninterrupted success." He smiled with a certain bitterness. "But you deserve to know the truth, especially now." He stood and walked to a nearby rose garden, where he cut a perfectly open red rose. He returned to Eleanor and offered her the flower. "My point is this: bubbles, however beautiful they may be, eventually burst. What we build in secret can be wonderful, but only what we expose to the light has a chance to take root and grow," he said, gently placing the rose in Eleanor's hands. "I'm not asking you to meet my family to please me. I'm asking because I want what we have to have the opportunity to become something deeper." Eleanor contemplated the rose, its velvety petals open in an invitation impossible to ignore. In that moment, she understood that she stood at a crossroads. She could continue taking refuge in the safety of secret meetings, or she could dare to step onto unfamiliar and potentially painful ground. "If I go with you, I want you to know something," she finally said, raising her eyes to meet his. "I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I can't pretend that I know about expensive wines or contemporary art. I'm the orphan who grew up among borrowed books and stolen dreams." Griffin smiled, and in his eyes shone a pride that Eleanor had never seen before. "That's exactly what I want my family to see, the authentic, courageous, extraordinary woman that you are," he responded, leaning to kiss her softly on the forehead. "Because that's exactly who I see every day. Under the springtime sun of New Orleans, surrounded by the scent of flowers and with a rose in her hands, Eleanor made a decision that would change the course of her story. It was a step toward the unknown, toward a world she had always observed from afar, but for the first time she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like someone about to claim her place in the world. Oakidge rose majestically among ancient oak trees, a colonial plantation house with white columns and a red-tiled roof that seemed to have been painted against the blue sky by some artist in love with contrasts. As Griffin's car advanced down the oak-lined driveway, Eleanor felt her stomach contract with each yard that brought them closer to the family mansion. "Breathe," Griffin reminded her, briefly placing his hand over hers. "They're just people, Eleanor. People who happen to be my family, but people all the same." She nodded, but the words of comfort barely eased her nervousness. She had dressed with great care, an olive-green silk dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, the first she had acquired without obsessively checking the price. Even so, she felt like an imposter. The car stopped in front of a marble fountain where water sang a crystalline melody. Before Griffin could open her door, a woman in her mid-30s with the same shade of eyes as him rushed out of the house. "Finally! I thought you'd gotten lost on one of those back roads you're so fond of," exclaimed Priscilla Montgomery, embracing her brother as soon as he stepped out of the vehicle. Her gaze immediately fell on Eleanor, assessing her with a curiosity she made no attempt to disguise. "So you're the mysterious librarian who's managed to make my brother read more in 3 months than in the last 10 years, she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor Blackwood," she introduced herself, shaking the offered hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Griffin talks about you often." "I hope only the kind lies," Priscilla responded with calculated lightness. "Come in. Everyone's waiting. Aunt Adelaide has come especially from Savannah to meet you." Eleanor felt the tension in Griffin's arm at the mention of that name, but before she could ask, they were enveloped in the whirlwind of family reception. The interior of the mansion was a testament to generations of good taste and prosperity. Polished hardwood floors, dark wood beams in high ceilings, and in every corner some object that whispered stories from other times, an antique fan framed on the wall, sepia photographs of stern-faced ancestors, colonial tiles that had witnessed centuries of Southern history. On the veranda, under a pergola that created a natural canopy of dappled shade, the Montgomery family had gathered. Eleanor immediately identified Aunt Adelaide by the way everyone seemed to orbit around her. A petite woman in her 60s, with silvery hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, and black eyes that seemed to absorb every detail. "So we finally meet the young woman who has tamed our lone wolf," said the elderly woman when they were introduced, her voice surprisingly melodious for someone her age. There was something in her gaze that unsettled Eleanor, as if she could see through layers and layers of carefully constructed defenses. "I don't believe Griffin needed taming, ma'am," she responded with more firmness than she felt. "The books simply reminded him of who he truly was." A murmur ran through the table. No one had expected the shy librarian to respond with such poise. Aunt Adelaide smiled, an enigmatic smile that seemed to contain secrets. "Interesting perspective," she conceded, "though I wonder if you truly know the man at your side." Lunch proceeded amid seemingly light conversations that concealed barely veiled interrogations. Eleanor navigated the minefield of questions about her past, her education, and her aspirations as best she could, aware that each response was being analyzed for ulterior motives. It was during dessert, an exquisite pecan pie prepared according to a family recipe, that the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Do you know anything about the legal process Griffin is facing in New York, dear?" asked one of the cousins, feigning innocence. "It must be so stressful for both of you." Silence fell over the table like a stone, Eleanor looked at Griffin, whose knuckles had turned white around the wine glass he was holding. "Lydia, this isn't the time," Priscilla warned, shooting her cousin a severe look. "What process?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice serene despite the confusion she felt. "It's nothing you need to worry about," Griffin responded, but the tension in his jaw contradicted his words. "If she's going to be part of this family, she has the right to know what she's getting into," Lydia insisted, ignoring the warning signals. "Malcolm Whitaker, his former partner, is suing him for misappropriation of a project in New York. If he wins, Griffin could lose everything. Again." The last words fell like poisoned darts. "That's enough," intervened Aunt Adelaide with authority. "We came to meet Eleanor, not to air matters that will be resolved in the appropriate courts." But the damage was done. Eleanor felt the ground beneath her feet shift. It wasn't the legal process that disturbed her, but the fact that Griffin hadn't considered it important to share something so fundamental with her. "If you'll excuse me," she said, rising with all the dignity she could muster, "I need a moment." She went out to the garden, where the scent of roses and the sound of water from the fountain would normally calm her nerves. This time, however, her mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. It wasn't long before she felt Griffin's presence behind her. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I was waiting for the right moment." "When would that be, Griffin?" she asked, turning to face him. "After you had lost everything? After I was too involved to turn back?" He took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw the invisible barrier Eleanor had erected around herself. "It's complicated, Eleanor. Malcolm was more than a partner. He was my best friend. When my wife Vivian left, he was the one who helped me rebuild. But power and money change people," he explained, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "His accusations are false, but he has influence in New York." "It's not the process that hurts me, Griffin," she responded quietly. "It's that you didn't trust me enough to share it. You've shown me roses and dances, but hidden the thorns." The words hung suspended between them, laden with uncomfortable truths. In the distance, they could hear the family voices, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the garden. "You're right," Griffin finally admitted. "I've protected you from the difficult parts because I was afraid that you'd see I'm not the perfect man you might have imagined." Eleanor moved closer then, reducing the physical distance between them. Her eyes, normally soft, now showed a steely determination. "I never wanted a perfect man, Griffin. I want a real man, with scars like mine," she said, gently placing a hand on his cheek. "But scars can only heal when exposed to the air." In that moment, under the southern sun that was beginning to decline, both understood they had reached a turning point. What began as a chance encounter in a library had transformed into something much deeper and more demanding. Something that required truth, however painful it might be. Griffin's office in downtown New Orleans reflected his personality, elegant without ostentation, functional without coldness, and with details that revealed an appreciation for history and beauty. From the large windows on the 13th floor, Jackson Square and the Mississippi River seemed close enough to touch. Eleanor observed the city while she waited. 2 weeks had passed since the tense family meeting at Oakidge, 2 weeks during which her relationship with Griffin had acquired a new dimension of honesty. He had explained every detail of the legal process to her, sharing documents, defense strategies, and above all his deepest fears. The door opened and Griffin entered, accompanied by his lawyer, a man with a tired appearance but alert eyes, whom Eleanor had met days before. "Thank you for coming, Nathaniel," said Griffin, shaking the lawyer's hand. "Eleanor and I greatly value your frankness." Nathaniel Wells nodded, placing his briefcase on the mahogany table. "As we've already discussed, the situation is complicated, but not desperate," he began, extracting several documents. "Malcolm Whitaker has influence, but his case is primarily supported by manipulated testimonies and a conveniently altered chronology of events." Eleanor listened attentively, her librarian's mind cataloguing each detail, looking for patterns and connections that might have gone unnoticed. "And the original documents for the project?" she asked. "Couldn't they demonstrate the true sequence of events?" Nathaniel and Griffin exchanged a look that didn't escape her notice. "That's the problem," Nathaniel responded. "The originals mysteriously disappeared from the company archives 3 years ago, right after Vivian left. The name Vivian fell into the room like a stone in a calm pond, creating ripples of tension. Despite the confidences of recent weeks, Griffin still hesitated to speak in depth about his ex-wife. "Do you think she might have taken them?" Eleanor asked directly, determined not to avoid difficult topics. Griffin approached the window, his profile silhouetted against the New Orleans sky. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Vivian and Malcolm always had a close relationship, but I don't want to believe she could do something like that." Nathaniel cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The problem remains the same. Without these documents, it all comes down to your word against Malcolm's. And in the current climate of New York, with the contacts he has in the industry..." Eleanor suddenly stood up, an idea forming in her mind. Were there copies of the contracts, the permits, the original plans? Anything? "Of course, but they've also disappeared," Griffin responded. "It was meticulous work." "I'm not referring to official copies," Eleanor insisted. "In my work, I've learned that people leave traces without realizing. Drafts, notes, emails, especially in large projects." Nathaniel seemed interested. "It's possible there was preliminary documentation in the company's historical archives," he conceded. "But we'd have to review thousands of documents from more than 10 years ago, many of them not even digitized." A smile slowly formed on Eleanor's face. "As it happens, I know someone who specializes in exactly that." 3 days later, Eleanor found herself in the basement of the Montgomery Enterprises corporate building, surrounded by dusty archive boxes. She had requested a week's leave from the university library to dedicate herself to this search, something she would never have done for anyone else. It was past midnight when her fingers, numbed from hours of reviewing documents, stumbled upon an envelope sealed with red wax at the bottom of a box, simply marked Personal GM 2014. The envelope, yellowed by time, had written on it in delicate calligraphy, "To be opened only in case of my permanent absence." Vivian. Eleanor held the envelope in her trembling hands, aware that she had found something significant, but unsure whether she should immediately call Griffin or respect the implicit privacy of the message. After a moment of reflection, she dialed Griffin's number. 20 minutes later, he entered the archive, the weariness visible in his eyes, but rapidly dissipating when he saw what Eleanor was holding. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In a box of personal documents," she responded, offering him the envelope. "I didn't open it, it's not my place." Griffin took the envelope with reverence, as if it were something fragile and precious. His fingers traced the calligraphy he knew so well. 10 years, he murmured. 10 years without a word, without an explanation. Eleanor took a step back, aware that this was too intimate a moment to share. "I'll leave you alone to—" "No," Griffin interrupted, extending his free hand to stop her. "Stay, please." Carefully, he broke the wax seal and extracted several folded sheets. As he read, his expression changed from surprise to understanding, and finally to a complex mixture of pain and relief. "Vivian never abandoned me, at least not as I believed," he finally said, raising his eyes to Eleanor. "Her mother wasn't just sick, she was dying of an inherited degenerative disease. Vivian discovered that she had also inherited it." Eleanor caught her breath, comprehending the magnitude of what she was hearing. "She left to protect me," Griffin continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "She didn't want me to see her deteriorate, didn't want me to go through that after all we had overcome together." He set the sheets on a nearby table and covered his face with his hands. Eleanor moved closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering her presence without words. "But there's more," he said after a moment, regaining some composure. "Vivian suspected Malcolm. Here she says she made copies of all the original documents from the New York project and left them in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. The key," he searched the envelope and extracted a small golden key, "was in the envelope." Eleanor felt her heart race. "That means that we can prove the truth," Griffin completed, a new determination shining in his eyes. "Vivian protected me until the end in her own way." In the silence of the archive, surrounded by yellowed paper and decades of dust, both felt that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just the possibility of winning the legal process, it was the liberation from a ghost that had haunted Griffin for years. "She wanted you to move forward," Eleanor said softly, pointing to the last page of the letter. "She says so here." Griffin read the final lines written by Vivian a decade ago. When you find this letter, I hope you have also found someone who loves you as you deserve to be loved. Someone who sees in you what I always saw, not just the brilliant businessman, but the compassionate man who hides behind that facade of confidence. Be happy, my love. That will be my greatest victory against the fate that has been imposed upon me. Eleanor and Griffin looked at each other through tears that neither now tried to hide. In that moment, in that unlikely place, they felt that the past was finally loosening its iron grip on the present, allowing them to glimpse for the first time the real possibility of a future together. Eleanor's fragmented reflection stared back at her from the cracked bathroom mirror. She had struck the surface with her closed fist in a moment of frustration, and now the fissures extended like cobwebs, distorting her image into dozens of imperfect versions of herself. The news had arrived that morning in the form of a terse email. We regret to inform you that your contract as assistant librarian will not be renewed at the end of the current term. Sincerely, Human Resources Department. 3 years of dedication, cataloguing forgotten books, restoring damaged volumes, creating welcoming spaces for lost students as she once had been, all ended with a few impersonal lines. Eleanor knew why. It was no coincidence that the notification arrived just a week after local newspapers published the first photographs of her and Griffin together at the jazz festival. The real estate magnate and the librarian, love or interest, read one of the more benevolent headlines. The library director, always concerned with the austere and academic image of the institution, had made no attempt to hide his disapproval of his employees' sudden notoriety. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Eleanor, are you all right? I've been calling you for 10 minutes, came Griffin's voice, tinged with concern. She opened the door, not bothering to hide her reddened eyes or the broken mirror behind her. They won't renew my contract, she said without preamble. Apparently, dating a prominent businessman makes me unsuitable for organizing books. Griffin entered the small bathroom, quickly assessing the situation. The broken mirror, Eleanor's slightly bloodied knuckles, the desolation in her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, taking her injured hand with delicacy. "This is my fault. If we hadn't gone to the jazz festival—" "No," she interrupted him firmly. "I won't let you blame yourself. It was my decision to be with you publicly. I knew there would be consequences." Griffin guided her out of the bathroom to the small sofa in the living room, where he seated her while he searched for the first aid kit. Eleanor observed in silence as he cleaned and bandaged her knuckles with the meticulousness of someone who had had to tend to himself many times. "The library was more than a job for you," he finally said without releasing her hand. "It was your sanctuary." Eleanor nodded, feeling tears threatening to return. "Since I left the orphanage, books have been my only constant," she confessed. "When everything else changed or disappeared, they remained there waiting for me. The library was my home." Griffin looked at her with a mixture of admiration and shared pain. "I can speak with the president of the university, use my contacts so they reconsider." "No," Eleanor cut him off. "I don't want a job that I have to beg for or that I obtain through your influence. That would only confirm what they already think of me." A heavy silence settled between them. Through the open window came the sounds of everyday life in the garden district. Vendors calling out, children playing, tourists marveling at every corner. Life continued, oblivious to small personal tragedies. "What do you want to do then?" Griffin finally asked. It was a simple question, but laden with meaning. He wasn't just asking about the job, he was asking about them, about their future, about the decisions that would define the course of their intertwined lives. Eleanor rose and walked to the window, observing the cobblestone street where the sunlight created shifting patterns. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I don't have a plan. I don't have a routine to cling to, nor a place to hide." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Griffin suggested, moving to stand beside her. "Sometimes getting lost is the first step to truly finding oneself." Eleanor looked at him, surprised by the depth of the observation. There were moments like this one, when Griffin demonstrated a wisdom that transcended business and material success, a wisdom born of his own falls and resurrections. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper, "afraid of depending on you, of losing my independence, of becoming an appendage to your life, and at the same time, I'm afraid of losing you if I distance myself to find my own path." Griffin took her hands, both the bandaged one and the uninjured one, and kissed them with reverence. "True love isn't a prison, Eleanor. It's a starting point," he said with serene voice. "I don't want you to depend on me. I want to walk beside you as you discover who you truly are, beyond the librarian, beyond the orphan, beyond all the roles you've assumed to survive." The words sank deeply into Eleanor, like rain on dry earth. Throughout her life, she had defined her identity in relation to something external: the orphanage, her studies, the library. She had never allowed herself to simply be without borrowed labels or definitions. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think, to decide what I truly want." Griffin nodded, though a flash of pain crossed his gaze. "I understand, and I'll be here when you're ready, whatever your decision." He leaned to kiss her softly on the forehead before heading to the door. Before leaving, he paused and turned back to her. "Just remember something, Eleanor. Sometimes broken mirrors don't distort reality. They simply show us the many versions that exist of ourselves, all equally true." After the door closed behind him, Eleanor remained by the window for hours, watching as the daylight gradually transformed into the golden glow of the New Orleans sunset. In her mind, Griffin's words resonated like a mantra, mingling with the sound of the city that she had never really felt was hers. For the first time since she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a life without the safe but limiting walls she had built herself. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like standing on the edge of a precipice, feeling simultaneously vertigo and the impulse to fly. That night, as she contemplated her fragmented reflection in the broken bathroom mirror, Eleanor didn't see chaos and destruction, but possibilities. Each fragment showed a different facet of who she might become if she dared to let go of the past. The question was, would she have the courage to try? The Savannah bus terminal bustled with activity under the relentless July sun. Eleanor descended from the vehicle with a small suitcase, and her heart beating wildly in her chest. She had made the decision impulsively, without consulting Griffin or anyone else. This was a journey she needed to undertake alone. The address noted on a piece of paper led her to an apartment building in Ardsley Park, a neighborhood far from the tourist Savannah displayed in postcards. It wasn't a deteriorated building, but neither was it one that stood out for its elegance. It was a functional, discreet place almost invisible in the urban landscape. Apartment 3B, Adelaide Blackwood, her mother. The revelation had come 3 weeks earlier, hidden among the documents they had recovered from Vivian's safety deposit box. A handwritten note attached to financial reports mentioned, "Continue the monthly payments to A. Blackwood as agreed with Griffin. Updated address attached." When she confronted Griffin, he hadn't tried to deny it. "I found her 5 years ago," he had confessed. "She was working as a cleaner in one of my buildings in Savannah. I recognized her from a photograph that was in your file at the orphanage." "And you decided to help her financially without telling me?" Eleanor had asked, the betrayal palpable in her voice. "She asked me to. She wasn't ready to see you, to face what she had done. I respected her wish, but I made sure that she at least had economic stability." Now, standing before the door of apartment 3B, Eleanor hesitated. What would she say to the woman who had abandoned her at 5 years old? How would she look into the eyes of someone who had decided that a life without her daughter was preferable? Before she could decide whether to knock or leave, the door opened, and there she was, smaller than Eleanor had imagined, with black hair streaked with grey pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes, her eyes, that widened in recognition. "Eleanor," said the woman, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who the young woman standing before her was. "I knew you would come someday," continued Adelaide, recovering from the initial surprise. "Since Griffin found you, I knew it was just a matter of time." Eleanor hadn't planned what she would say, and now the words stuck in her throat. All the anger, confusion and pain she had imagined she would feel dissolved in the face of the reality of the woman before her. Not a monster who had abandoned her, but a human being with worry lines and hands reddened by years of hard work. "May I come in?" was all she managed to articulate. The apartment was small but immaculate. Framed photographs decorated the walls, and Eleanor stopped short when she recognized herself in some of them. Her high school graduation, her first day at university, herself standing in front of the library where she worked. "I got them all through Griffin," explained Adelaide, noticing her surprise. I've followed every step of your life even though I had no right to. They sat on a small sofa by a window that overlooked an inner courtyard where hanging laundry created a colorful contrast with the white walls. Why? Eleanor finally asked, the word containing a lifetime of unanswered questions. Adelaide interlaced her fingers, a gesture that Eleanor recognized as her own when she was nervous. The simple answer would be to blame poverty, my youth, family pressure, she began, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the window. And all of that was real. But the truth is more complex. I was afraid, Eleanor, paralyzingly afraid of not being enough for you. She paused as if gathering strength to continue. Your father was a married man, an important businessman who promised me the world and disappeared when he learned of my pregnancy. I was 18 and worked cleaning houses. My family turned their backs on me. For 5 years I tried, I swear by all that's sacred, but each day was a struggle. Each night I fell asleep fearing that the next day I wouldn't be able to feed you. Eleanor listened in silence, the pieces of her personal history slowly fitting together. The Charleston orphanage had a good reputation, continued Adelaide. I thought you would have more opportunities there than with me. That some family would adopt you and you'd have the life I could never give you. Tears now flowed freely down Adelaide's face, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. I returned 6 months later when I got a better job. I wanted to get you back, her voice broke. But they told me you were adapting well, that you were a brilliant child with a future. They convinced me that reappearing would only cause you more confusion and pain. And I was cowardly enough to believe them. Eleanor felt something breaking and healing simultaneously inside her. It wasn't the story she had imagined, nor the justification she had feared hearing. And Griffin? She asked. How does he fit into this story? A sad smile formed on Adelaide's lips. Griffin and I met many years ago during the August festivals in Savannah. He was a young man from a good family vacationing there. I was a local girl who served at the restaurant in the square. We had a summer romance, but our worlds were too different. Is he... Eleanor couldn't complete the question. Your father? No, dear. But I think part of his interest in you at the beginning was because you reminded him of the girl he knew that summer. He has a noble heart, Eleanor, despite everything he's been through. Eleanor stood and walked to the photographs, observing the moments of her life that her mother had followed from a distance. When Griffin found me, continued Adelaide, he already knew who you were. He offered me financial help and the opportunity to reunite with you when I was ready. But you never were, said Eleanor, more a statement than a question. Time passes and guilt grows, daughter, Adelaide responded with simplicity. Each year that passed convinced me more that I had no right to enter your life, to disturb the person you were becoming without me. Eleanor returned to the sofa and after a moment of hesitation took her mother's hands in hers. They were rough and prematurely aged, hands that told the story of a life of hard work and sacrifices. I can't say I forgive you, not yet, she said with honesty, but I can try to understand, and maybe that's a beginning. Adelaide nodded, her tears now silent. It's more than I deserve, she responded, and more than I ever expected to have. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, filling in the gaps of 2 decades apart. Eleanor discovered they shared more than eye color, and the habit of interlacing their fingers when nervous. They had the same love for William Faulkner's stories, the same intolerance for seafood, the same habit of humming unconsciously while thinking. When they finally said goodbye at the apartment door, with the promise to see each other again, Eleanor felt that something fundamental had changed within her. It wasn't the complete resolution she might have hoped for, but it was the beginning of a deeper understanding of herself and her history. On the bus back to New Orleans, as she contemplated the southern landscape bathed in the golden light of sunset, she understood that the most important journey hadn't been the physical trip to Savannah, but the emotional path to the roots of her identity. And for the first time since she had lost her job at the library, she felt that perhaps she was finding something much more valuable than what she had left behind. The cafe at the New Orleans Historical Archives hummed with mid-morning activity. Students and researchers filled the tables, taking advantage of the brief break to recharge before returning to immerse themselves in ancient documents and dusty manuscripts. Eleanor occupied a corner table, surrounded by notes and photocopies. For 3 weeks she had been systematically investigating the corporate archives of New Orleans, looking for any mention of the New York project that might help Griffin's case. The work was meticulous and exhausting, but it gave her a purpose, something to hold on to as she rebuilt her professional life. "May I join you?" asked a familiar voice. She looked up to find Priscilla, Griffin's sister, holding a cup of coffee and observing her with an inscrutable expression. "Of course," Eleanor responded, clearing a space among the papers. Almost 2 months had passed since the tense family lunch at Oakidge, and although Eleanor had continued her relationship with Griffin, she had barely had contact with the rest of the Montgomery family. "My brother told me you were helping with the investigation," Priscilla began, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness. "I must admit I was surprised." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, aware of the constant evaluation in Priscilla's eyes. "Griffin matters to me. It's natural that I want to help. Many people say someone matters to them, but few are willing to spend weeks buried in dusty archives to prove it," Priscilla responded, with a smile that seemed slightly less forced than in previous encounters. "Especially after losing your job for being associated with him." The comment touched a sensitive nerve. Eleanor hadn't shared with Griffin the full magnitude of the professional ostracism she was experiencing. Not only had the university decided not to renew her contract, other libraries and archives in the city had casually rejected her employment applications. "I don't blame Griffin for that," she said firmly. "It was my decisions that brought me here." Priscilla studied her with renewed interest. "You know, when my brother started talking about you, I was certain you were another opportunist," she confessed bluntly. "Griffin has a history of attracting people who see his wallet before his heart." "Like Vivian," Eleanor pointed out, surprising Priscilla with her frankness. "Vivian was complicated," the sister admitted after a moment. "But no, actually I was thinking of other relationships. Women who appeared after Vivian left, when Griffin was most vulnerable." Eleanor set down her pen, giving Priscilla her complete attention. "He's never spoken to me about them." "He wouldn't. It was a time he prefers to forget." Priscilla took a sip of coffee before continuing. "My point is that I've seen many women come and go in my brother's life. They all wanted something. Contacts, social position, financial backing. You're the first who seems to want simply him." The words hung suspended between them, laden with a tacit recognition that Eleanor hadn't expected. "I want him as he is," she confirmed quietly, "with his fears, his scars, and his silences. I don't need his money or his influence." "I've noticed that," Priscilla responded with a genuine smile. "In fact, you seem uncomfortably determined to reject any financial help he tries to offer." Eleanor smiled in turn, acknowledging the accuracy of the observation. "Independence is important to me, perhaps too much so." "It's understandable given your background," said Priscilla, again surprising Eleanor. "Yes, Griffin told me about the orphanage. Not the details, just the essentials. I hope you don't mind." "No, it's fine," Eleanor responded after a moment of reflection. "It's part of who I am." A comfortable silence settled between them as Priscilla observed the notes scattered across the table. "Have you found anything useful?" she finally asked, indicating the documents. "Possibly," Eleanor hesitated before continuing. "There are records of correspondence between Griffin's office in New Orleans and the architect's firm in New York that don't appear in the official case files. If I could locate those original letters..." Priscilla seemed to consider something before leaning forward. "Have you checked my father's personal archives?" she asked quietly. "Many important business decisions passed through him, even when he had already formally handed control to Griffin." Eleanor shook her head. "I don't have access to those archives. They're restricted to family." "I can fix that," Priscilla responded, taking out her phone. "In fact, I think it's time you had proper access to all the resources you need for this investigation." As Priscilla made a call, Eleanor felt a mixture of surprise and gratitude. It was the first time any member of Griffin's family, aside from himself, had shown real trust in her. "It's done," Priscilla announced as she hung up. "You'll have a full credential for the corporate archives starting tomorrow." "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely. "That means a lot." Priscilla put away her phone and looked at Eleanor with renewed seriousness. "Eleanor, there's something else you should know," she paused, as if evaluating how much to say. "Griffin isn't well. He's not sleeping, barely eating, and making impulsive decisions in business. He's putting everything at risk because of this case." Concern immediately settled in Eleanor's chest. "He hasn't told me anything," she responded, remembering that she had indeed noticed Griffin more distant and tense in recent weeks. but had assumed he was giving her the space she had requested. He wouldn't, Priscilla confirmed. His greatest fear has always been being a burden to others. It's something that comes from our father. She stopped, as if she had said too much. The point is, he's fighting alone, as always. Eleanor remembered the nights when Griffin had fallen asleep on her sofa while they reviewed documents, the weariness evident in the lines of his face. She had attributed his exhaustion to the stress of the case, not to a deeper deterioration. "What can I do?" she asked, determination replacing concern. Priscilla studied her for a moment before responding. "Sometimes silence is more dangerous than the harshest words," she finally said. "Griffin needs to know he's not alone in this, that he doesn't have to protect you from the truth of his situation." "I never asked him to protect me," Eleanor protested. "Not with words," Priscilla conceded, "but by maintaining your emotional distance, by insisting on your independence at all costs. You've given him the message that there are boundaries he shouldn't cross." The words hit Eleanor with the force of a revelation. In her determination not to depend on Griffin, to find her own path, perhaps she had erected barriers that he, with his own history of abandonment, interpreted as rejection. "That wasn't my intention," she murmured, more to herself than to Priscilla. "Intentions rarely align with perceptions," the sister responded, rising and gathering her bag. "Just think about it, Eleanor. My brother has spent 10 years building walls around his heart. It won't be easy to tear them down, especially if you continue building your own." With those words, Priscilla said goodbye with a nod and left the cafe, leaving Eleanor surrounded by papers that suddenly seemed much less important than the truths she had just heard. That afternoon, as the New Orleans sun began its slow descent, Eleanor understood that the most urgent investigation wasn't the one she was conducting in the dusty archives, but the one she needed to undertake in her own heart. Griffin's apartment in the French Quarter reflected his duality. The ground floor maintained the traditional structure of the colonial house, with its central courtyard and granite columns, while the upper floor had been transformed into a contemporary space where glass and clean lines predominated. It was a place he rarely shared with others, his private refuge from the outside world. Eleanor had never been there until that night. Griffin opened the door with a surprised expression. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and cotton pants, an informal outfit that contrasted with his usual impeccable public image. "Eleanor," he said, visibly confused, "I wasn't expecting... Has something happened?" She observed him carefully, now noticing the signs she had overlooked, the deep shadows under his eyes, the paleness of his face, the evident tension in his shoulders. "We need to talk," she responded, her voice firm but gentle. "And this time really talk." He stepped aside to let her enter, and Eleanor walked down the hallway to the central courtyard, where a small fountain created a watery melody that resonated softly against the white walls. "It's beautiful," she commented, genuinely impressed by the harmony of the space. "It was my maternal grandmother's house," Griffin explained, following her. "The only person who always believed in me, even when I failed." They sat on a tiled bench beside the fountain. The New Orleans night was warm but pleasant, with the scent of jasmine flowers floating in the air. "Priscilla came to see me today," Eleanor began, determined not to beat around the bush. "She told me you're not well, that you're barely eating or sleeping." Griffin tensed his jaw, evidently bothered by his sister's intervention. "Priscilla has always had a tendency toward drama," he responded with forced lightness. "I'm perfectly fine." "No, you're not," Eleanor insisted, taking his hand. "And I've been so focused on my own struggles that I didn't notice, or perhaps I didn't want to see." Griffin tried to withdraw his hand, but Eleanor held it firmly. "We didn't come to talk about me," he protested. "If there's any news about the case—" "This isn't about the case," she interrupted. "It's about us. About everything we haven't said to each other." A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the constant murmur of water in the fountain. Griffin finally sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of surrender. "I've been having nightmares," he confessed. "I'm dreaming again about the time when I lost everything. Only this time, it's not just the money or the company I lose. It's you." The vulnerability in his voice shook Eleanor. She had expected resistance, even anger, but not this bare confession. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "Because you already have enough with your own battles," he responded with simplicity. "You lost your job because of me. You're rebuilding your relationship with Adelaide. You're trying to find your place in the world. The last thing you needed was to carry my fears as well. Eleanor stood up, unable to contain the energy bubbling inside her. That's not your decision, she said, her voice firmer than she intended. You can't unilaterally decide what I can or can't handle. You can't protect me from the reality of being with you. I'm 20 years older than you, Eleanor, he responded, also standing. I've seen how the weight of my problems has crushed more experienced people than you. Vivian couldn't bear it, and she... He stopped abruptly, as if he had said too much. She what? Eleanor pressed, sensing they had reached a crucial point. Griffin walked to the other end of the courtyard, turning his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if coming from a place much deeper than the night's silence. Vivian didn't leave just because of her illness. She left because I smothered her with my need to protect her, to solve everything for her, to be her savior. The words now emerged like a torrent contained for too long. In her letter, the one you found, there are parts I didn't show you, parts where she explains how my love, intense as it was, made her feel invisible, as if she only existed in relation to me, never for herself. He turned to look at Eleanor, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm terrified of making the same mistake with you, of loving you in a way that erases you, that turns you into an appendage of my life instead of the extraordinary force that you are. Eleanor crossed the courtyard to reach him, reducing the physical distance he had created. But by hiding your fears, by pretending everything is fine while you're crumbling inside, aren't you doing exactly that? She asked. Aren't you deciding for me, underestimating my capacity to stand by your side in difficult moments? Griffin looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time that night. You're right, he finally admitted. It's the same trap, just disguised as consideration. Eleanor took his hands in hers, feeling the tension that ran through them. The day we met at the dance hall, you said that jazz was the most honest conversation I would ever have with the earth, she reminded him. I think it's time we have our own honest conversation, Griffin, not as the businessman and the librarian, not as the protector and the protected, just as two people trying to find a path together through their own fears. Griffin nodded slowly, and something in his expression seemed to soften. How? He asked simply. Dancing, she responded, surprising him. She moved away to retrieve her phone from the purse she had left by the fountain. After a few moments, the notes of a slow, emotional blues began to fill the courtyard. No words this time, she said, returning to him and adopting the initial posture for the dance. Just truth. For the next few minutes, under the silvery moonlight filtering through the courtyard trees, Eleanor and Griffin danced. It wasn't the precise choreography they had practiced in the library, nor the stylized version they had shared in the Golden Hall that first day. It was something more primitive and honest, a dialogue of bodies where each movement, each gesture revealed what words had hidden. The accumulated tension of weeks of misunderstandings and half-truths dissolved with each footfall, with each turn. Griffin's desperation, his fear of losing her, manifested in the intensity with which he held her during the spins. Eleanor's determination, her refusal to be treated as someone fragile, reflected in the strength of her movements, the firmness of her posture. When the music ended, they both stopped, breathless and emotionally exhausted. But something fundamental had changed between them. In the silence that followed, the barriers each had built seemed to have crumbled, leaving only the naked truth of who they were and what they felt. I love you, Griffin said, the words emerging without premeditation. Not as possession, not as project, not as reflection. I love you in your entirety, with your contradictions and your certainties, with your strength and your vulnerabilities. Eleanor felt something untying within her, a tension that had been present for so long she had forgotten how it was to exist without it. And I love you, she responded, the simplicity of the words contrasting with the complexity of the feelings they expressed. Not for what you can give me or do for me, but for who you are when all defenses fall. For the man who dances barefoot under the moon, who cries without shame, who is afraid but continues forward. They embraced in the center of the courtyard, under the starry New Orleans sky, not as savior and saved, but as two navigators who had finally found a safe harbor after too much time adrift. That night marked a before and after. It wasn't the end of their struggles, nor the magical solution to all their problems. But it was the beginning of something more authentic, a commitment to walk together through the darkness, holding the light for each other when the path became too uncertain. The New York courtroom gleamed with a cold light filtering through the high windows, illuminating the dust suspended in the air. The polished wooden benches were occupied mainly by journalists and some curious onlookers who had managed to get in. In the front row, Eleanor sat beside Priscilla, both with tense expressions as the judge reviewed the submitted documents. It had been 3 months of tireless work. After their reconciliation that night in the French Quarter courtyard, Eleanor and Griffin had formed an unbreakable team. She had continued her meticulous search in the archives, now with full access thanks to Priscilla, while Griffin rebuilt contacts in New York and prepared the defense with Nathaniel. The great discovery had come in the most unexpected way. On one of her trips to Savannah to visit Adelaide, now a regular if still complicated presence in her life, Eleanor had casually mentioned the case. "Malcolm Whitaker?" Adelaide had asked, furrowing her brow. "Tall with a small scar next to his left eye." Eleanor's heart had raced at the precise description. "I met him," Adelaide had continued. "He used to come often to Griffin's building in Savannah, about 8 or 9 years ago. He always arrived very early before anyone else and asked for access to the offices to review some documents." That information had been the first thread of a skein that, when unraveled, revealed Malcolm had been manipulating records and documents for years, long before his official break with Griffin. The original copies found in Vivian's safety deposit box had provided the base evidence, but it was the testimony of 3 former cleaning staff, located thanks to Adelaide, that sealed the case. Now, as the judge announced his decision, Eleanor tightly gripped Priscilla's hand. "In light of the evidence presented, this court determines that there are no grounds for the charges against Griffin Montgomery and Montgomery Enterprises. The case is dismissed in its entirety, with costs to be borne by the plaintiff." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Griffin, seated with Nathaniel at the defense table, maintained his serene expression, only a slight nod indicating he had heard the verdict. Malcolm Whitaker, for his part, abruptly stood and left the room without looking back, followed by his lawyers. Only when the session was concluded and journalists began to disperse did Griffin allow himself a moment of vulnerability. He approached Eleanor and Priscilla and, without words, enveloped both in an embrace that contained all the relief, gratitude and exhaustion accumulated over months. "It's over," murmured Priscilla, her usual composure abandoning her for an instant. "It's finally over." Griffin pulled away, his eyes seeking Eleanor's. "All of this is thanks to you," he said with a voice laden with emotion. "Your perseverance, your intelligence." "It was a team effort," Eleanor interrupted, uncomfortable with the exclusive recognition. "Priscilla, Nathaniel, Adelaide, the former employees who testified, everyone contributed." "Always minimizing your achievements," smiled Priscilla, affectionately squeezing Eleanor's arm. "A refreshing quality in these times." The journey back to New Orleans on the plane passed in comfortable silence. Griffin reviewed emails and messages accumulated during the trial, while Eleanor observed the New York landscape gradually transforming into the beaches and hills of Louisiana. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing her lost gaze at the window. "About how books were always right," she responded, with an enigmatic smile. "About how the most important stories of our lives are sometimes written on pages we believed were lost." Griffin set down his phone and turned to look at her fully. "Speaking of books," he began with certain hesitation, "there's something I've wanted to discuss with you for weeks, but with the pending trial it didn't seem like the right time." Eleanor felt a small knot of apprehension forming in her stomach. Despite the advances in their relationship, part of her still expected the other shoe to drop eventually. "The building next to Jackson Square, the one that housed that old bookstore that closed last year," he continued. "I bought it 3 months ago." "Another real estate investment?" she asked, trying to understand the relevance. "Actually," Griffin took a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. "It's a gift. For you." With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the folder. Inside were architectural plans and a detailed project titled Magnolia Cultural Center. "I don't understand," she murmured, turning pages that showed a beautifully designed space with bookshelves, reading areas, and a central courtyard where cultural events were visualized. "I want you to direct it," Griffin explained. "A space that combines the best of a traditional library with cultural activities for the community. Writing workshops, poetry nights, reading programs for children from disadvantaged neighborhoods. He stopped when he saw Eleanor's expression. "It's too much," she said finally, closing the folder. "I can't accept it." The pain was visible in Griffin's eyes, but he quickly replaced it with understanding. "I understand your concern for independence," he said softly. "But this isn't charity, Eleanor. It's an investment in a project with real potential, directed by the most qualified person I know." "I don't have experience in cultural management," she protested. "I was barely an assistant librarian." "You have passion, knowledge, and a unique vision of what books can mean in people's lives," he responded. "The rest can be learned." Eleanor contemplated the closed folder on her lap, her mind divided between excitement at the possibilities and fear of compromising her hard-won autonomy. "I need time to think about it," she finally said. Griffin nodded, respecting her process. "All the time you need," he responded. The building isn't going anywhere. The rest of the trip passed in lighter conversation, but the folder remained a tangible presence between them, a symbol of future possibilities that required present decisions. That night, alone in her small Garden District apartment, Eleanor spread the plans on her table and studied them carefully. The project was meticulously thought out, with areas dedicated to each of the literary passions she had casually mentioned to Griffin during their conversations in the library. As she contemplated the potential future represented in those technical drawings, she understood that her reluctance wasn't born from fear of losing her independence. It was born from fear of accepting that she deserved something so perfect, so adapted to her deepest dreams. All her life she had grown accustomed to settling for less, adapting to spaces others defined for her. First the orphanage, then the university with its limited scholarships, then the library with its institutional restrictions. She had never had the opportunity to create something truly her own, something that reflected her vision of the world. With trembling fingers, she took her phone and wrote a message to Griffin. "The project is beautiful, but I need it to be ours, not just yours for me. I want to contribute financially and conceptually, not as an employee but as a partner. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" The response arrived almost immediately. "I always knew you would say exactly that. That's why the legal documents on the last page of the folder are already drafted as a partnership. Read them when you're ready. And yes, let's talk tomorrow. I love you." Eleanor returned to the plans, now seeing the project with new eyes. It wasn't a handout or a golden cage. It was an invitation to build something together, something that would honor both her passion for books and Griffin's business vision. For the first time since she had lost her job at the university library, she felt that the pages of her own story weren't being erased, but restored, and continued with a more vibrant and lasting ink. The night of the Magnolia Cultural Center's inauguration arrived with the perfection of a long-dreamed and meticulously planned moment. The old building next to Jackson Square gleamed with a transformation that had respected its historical essence while infusing it with new life. Wrought iron lanterns illuminated the entrance path, where a red carpet, a theatrical touch from Priscilla, who had taken a surprisingly active role in the preparations, led guests to the interior. The scent of magnolias, coming from the freshly planted trees in the central courtyard, mingled with the unmistakable perfume of new books. Eleanor observed the scene from the second-floor balcony, a stolen moment of solitude before immersing herself in the night's responsibilities. She wore a turquoise silk dress, chosen by herself in one of New Orleans' most exclusive boutiques, an indulgence she could now afford as co-director of the center. The last 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity, supervising the renovation work, selecting the initial book collection, designing cultural programs, interviewing staff. Eleanor had discovered in herself an organizational capacity and strategic vision she had never had the opportunity to develop in her previous roles. "Hiding from your admirers?" asked a familiar voice behind her. She turned to find Griffin, impeccable in his dark suit with an expression of pride he made no attempt to disguise. "Just stealing a moment to process all this," she responded, indicating the courtyard where dozens of guests were already congregating. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it's real." Griffin approached and placed an arm around her waist, contemplating with her the culmination of their joint project. "Do you know what's most extraordinary?" he said. "That this is just the beginning." Below, Eleanor could distinguish familiar faces among the crowd. Priscilla chatted animatedly with the mayor of New Orleans, Nathaniel, the lawyer, seemed surprisingly relaxed as he examined the mystery novel section. Adelaide, elegant in a simple navy blue dress that Eleanor had insisted on giving her, conversed timidly with some guests, her integration into her daughter's life progressing day by day. And even in a more secluded corner, Eleanor distinguished Aunt Adelaide Montgomery, who had initially been the most skeptical about her relationship with Griffin, examining with apparent approval the first volumes of a collection of Southern poetry that Eleanor had personally selected. "It's time," said Griffin, checking his watch. "Everyone is waiting for your speech." Eleanor breathed deeply, feeling a tingle of nerves. Despite months of preparation, meetings with suppliers, architects, and cultural authorities, public speaking remained a challenge. What if they're not ready to hear a former orphan speak about the importance of books in building community? She asked, only half joking. Griffin looked at her with an intensity that still, after more than a year together, made her heart race. "The world is always ready to hear those who speak from authenticity and passion," he responded. "And no one embodies those qualities better than you." They descended together the elegant marble staircase that led to the central courtyard. As they advanced among the guests, Eleanor noticed the looks of admiration and respect, so different from the expressions of condescension or suspicion she had faced in the early days of her relationship with Griffin. She was no longer seen as the librarian who had caught a millionaire. She was recognized as the visionary behind an innovative cultural project, a woman who had transformed her love for books into a meeting place for the entire city. Griffin approached the small podium installed beside the central fountain, where a microphone system waited. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice resonating clearly in the courtyard. "It is an immense honor to welcome you to the inauguration of the Magnolia Cultural Center." He paused, scanning the attendees with his gaze. "Many of you know me as a businessman, as a real estate investor, but this project represents something different. It's not simply a commercial transaction, it's a wager on the transformative power of culture, of books, of shared stories." His gaze rested on Eleanor. "And none of this would have been possible without the vision, determination, and heart of my partner and companion, Eleanor Blackwood. She has been the soul of this project from its conception, and she is the one who can best explain to you what Magnolia aspires to be." With a gesture, he invited her to join him at the podium. Eleanor advanced, feeling how the murmur of the audience gradually faded. When she reached Griffin, he gently squeezed her hand before yielding his place at the microphone. Eleanor looked at the expectant audience. The speech she had meticulously prepared over days now seemed inadequate, too formal for the emotion she felt. "A little over a year ago," she began, deciding to speak from the heart, "I entered a New Orleans dance hall with an invitation I didn't believe I deserved. That night, as the scent of magnolias filled the air, my life changed forever. Not just because I met the man who stands beside me today, but because for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't limited by my circumstances or my past." She paused, observing how her words resonated with those present. The Magnolia Cultural Center is born from that same premise, to create a space where people can imagine different futures through books, art, the exchange of ideas. A place where children from orphanages like the one that took me in can find in reading not just an escape, but a door to possibilities that perhaps no one has shown them before. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, the initial shyness replaced by the passion she felt for the project. "This center is not a charity project. It's an investment in the best we have as a society, our capacity to tell and share stories, to build bridges of understanding through the written word, to transform ourselves through culture." She looked at Griffin, who was watching her with eyes bright with emotion. "And it's also a testament to what can be achieved when we unite seemingly different visions. That of the business world, which provides structure and viability, and that of the cultural realm, which provides meaning and purpose." When she finished her brief speech, the spontaneous applause that arose from the audience had a quality that went beyond courtesy. It was the genuine recognition of a vision that had touched something deep in those present. The rest of the night passed as if in a dream. The center was officially inaugurated with the cutting of a silk ribbon by the mayor. The guests toured the different rooms, admiring both the restored architecture and the careful selection of books and works of art. In the courtyard, a jazz quartet provided a perfectly New Orleans musical background. Near midnight, When most of the official guests had departed and only close friends and family remained, Griffin approached Eleanor, who was conversing with Adelaide and Priscilla by the fountain. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand in a gesture that intentionally evoked their first encounter. The musicians began to play a smooth jazz number, and Eleanor took his hand without hesitation. Unlike that first night, she now moved with the confidence of someone who had found her own rhythm in life. As they danced in the center of the courtyard, under stars that seemed to shine especially for them, Griffin leaned to whisper in her ear, "I've been thinking about the perfect moment for this for weeks, and I believe there couldn't be a better one than this." He stopped, and to the surprise of Eleanor and the few present, knelt before her, extracting from his jacket pocket a small velvet box. "Eleanor Blackwood," he said, his voice resonating in the silent courtyard. "We began our journey with a dance, and each step since then has brought us closer to this moment. You've taught me that loving isn't possessing or protecting, but growing together and building something larger than ourselves." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a solitary emerald surrounded by small diamonds. "Would you do me the honor of turning our dance into a shared life dance?" Time seemed to stop. In Griffin's eyes, Eleanor saw reflected all the moments they had shared. The nights in the library, the bread pudding in her small apartment, the secrets revealed at Oakidge, Vivian's letter, her meeting with Adelaide, the victory in court, and finally, the creation of this space that represented the best of both of them. "Yes," she responded, her voice clear and decided. 1,000 times yes. As Griffin slid the ring onto her finger, the few present erupted in applause. Adelaide cried silently, perhaps seeing in that moment a partial redemption for the lost years. Priscilla, habitually reserved, made no attempt to hide her emotion. When Griffin stood and kissed her, Eleanor felt they were completing a perfect circle. Just as the scent of magnolias had announced the beginning of their story, now it perfumed the start of a new chapter. The dance resumed, but this time with a different quality. It was no longer a test or a learning process, but a celebration of two people who had found in each other not just love, but the best version of themselves. 18 months later, the courtyard of the French quarterhouse glowed under the spring sun. The magnolias, now more lush, cast dancing shadows over the guests who conversed animatedly around tables decorated with wildflowers and antique books that served as centerpieces. Eleanor observed the scene from the second-floor balcony, her white silk dress moving gently with the breeze that carried the scent of the Mississippi River mingled with the unmistakable perfume of magnolia blossoms. "Ready?" asked Adelaide, approaching with barely contained emotion. Over the past 2 years, their relationship had blossomed slowly, like a plant that needs time and care after a long winter. It wasn't perfect. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely, but it was authentic, built on forgiveness and mutual acceptance. "Almost," Eleanor responded, adjusting one last time the simple crown of magnolia flowers that adorned her upswept hair. "How is he?" "Nervous," Adelaide smiled. "Priscilla says he's changed his tie 3 times. Eleanor laughed, imagining Griffin, usually so composed, succumbing to pre-wedding nerves. The wedding had been planned as a reflection of their relationship, intimate but meaningful, traditional in essence but unique in details. They had chosen to celebrate it at home, in the courtyard where they had danced on that crucial night that transformed their relationship. Only 50 guests, close friends and family, who had witnessed their shared journey. The Magnolia Cultural Center, now in its 2nd year of operation, had exceeded all expectations. Its reading programs for disadvantaged children had received national recognition, and the poetry and jazz nights had become an unmissable appointment for New Orleans residents. Eleanor had found her true vocation as cultural director, combining her love for books with an innate talent for connecting people through art. Griffin, for his part, had reoriented some of his investments toward projects with social impact, inspired by Eleanor's vision. Together, they had created a foundation that provided scholarships for young people from orphanages who wanted to study at university, thus closing a circle that had begun with Eleanor's own experience. "It's time," announced Priscilla, joining them on the balcony. She wore an elegant lavender dress and, for the first time since Eleanor had known her, seemed relaxed and genuinely happy. The 3 women descended the staircase that led to the courtyard. At the foot of the steps waited Nathaniel, who had become a close friend after the legal battle. with his arm extended to escort Eleanor. "He's waiting," he said simply, with a knowing smile. The music began to play softly, not the traditional wedding march, but an original composition for jazz saxophone that they had commissioned specifically for the occasion. The guests stood as Eleanor advanced down the improvised aisle between the chairs. And there, under an arch of magnolia blossoms and jasmine, stood Griffin. His expression as he watched her approach contained everything they had shared: wonder, gratitude, respect, and a love that had matured like fine southern bourbon, gaining depth and complexity with time. When Eleanor reached his side, he took her hands and kissed them with reverence. "You are more beautiful than words can describe," he whispered. "And you seem to have found the perfect tie," she joked, easing the solemnity of the moment. The ceremony was brief but emotional. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, words that captured not just promises for the future, but also acknowledgments of the path traveled. They spoke of libraries and dances, of lost and found letters, of falls and shared resurrections. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Griffin didn't immediately kiss Eleanor, as tradition dictated. Instead, he knelt before her and, in a gesture that surprised all present, gently removed her shoes. "So you can feel the earth beneath your feet," he said, recalling the words of their first jazz lesson, "because our marriage will be the most honest conversation we'll ever have with life." Eleanor, barefoot like him, joined Griffin in the center of the courtyard as the musicians began to play a slow, emotional jazz piece. They danced as they had done so many times, but this first dance as a married couple held a special significance. It wasn't a demonstration for the guests, but an intimate dialogue between two people who had learned each other's language. As the sun descended, bathing the courtyard in a golden light, the celebration transformed into an authentic New Orleans party. Wine flowed generously, conversations became more animated, and dancing extended beyond the central couple. Eleanor observed the scene with a sense of fullness she would never have imagined possible. She saw Adelaide conversing animatedly with Aunt Adelaide Montgomery. The old tensions dissolved in shared laughter. Priscilla danced with one of the musicians, her habitual reserve replaced by a contagious spontaneity. Even Nathaniel had abandoned his lawyer's composure and enthusiastically clapped to the rhythm of the music. At one point in the evening, Griffin approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "A moment to breathe," he suggested, indicating a quiet corner of the garden. They briefly withdrew from the bustle of the party, finding refuge under a magnolia tree heavy with blossoms. "Are you happy?" he asked, interlacing his fingers with hers. Eleanor considered the question, not because she doubted the answer, but because she wanted to honor the depth of what she felt. "I am more than happy," she finally responded. "I am complete. Not because you complete me, but because together we've created a space where both of us can be who we truly are." Griffin nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. "When I first saw you in the library, organizing those old volumes with such care, something in me recognized something in you," he confessed. "It wasn't just attraction or curiosity. It was as if a forgotten part of my soul said, 'Ah, there you are. I've been looking for you.'" "Destiny has curious ways of manifesting," Eleanor smiled, "sometimes in the form of a golden invitation, sometimes in the scent of magnolias." They raised their glasses in a silent toast, not needing words to celebrate what they had found. From the distance, the notes of a new melody reached them. The guests were calling them for another dance. Griffin set his glass on a small stone bench and extended his hand to Eleanor, in a gesture that repeated the one from that first encounter in the Golden Dance Hall of New Orleans. "Shall we dance, Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked with a smile that illuminated his eyes. "Always," she responded, taking his hand. And as they returned to the party, under a starry New Orleans spring sky, Eleanor understood that some stories don't really end. They transform, evolve, find new rhythms and melodies. The orphaned girl who doubted she was worthy of love had found not just someone who loved her, but also the courage to love herself. The lonely businessman who feared repeating past mistakes had discovered that loving didn't mean possessing or protecting, but growing together. And as they danced surrounded by the people who had been part of their journey, the scent of magnolias floated in the air like a silent witness to a universal truth, that even the most wounded hearts can blossom when they find the fertile ground of true love. In that perfect moment, With music enveloping the courtyard and the intoxicating perfume of magnolia blossoms saturating the spring night, Eleanor and Griffin weren't simply a couple celebrating their wedding. They were living proof that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we read in books, but those we have the courage to write with our own lives.